Hello, everybody. Welcome to session 6 out of 8 of the Digital Catholic Social Teaching, DCST, course that Shrikant has been sponsoring here. Once again, thank you, Shrikant, for this opportunity. And thank you all for attending. Your participation in this is extremely important. As you may recall from previous sessions, this is an experiment in a new medium. So this isn't simply a Zoom call. What we're trying to do is build a navigable, scribal hyperbook. And that involves a number of other elements, and Shrikant will return to that theme when I get done with what we're describing here today. Let me preface today's comments by saying it is little known. It's not a secret by any means. May or may not surprise you, but I think I would have once called myself, maybe out of the corner of my eye, a Marxist. It was certainly an unusual Marxist. I'm an old guy, and so I graduated from University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1970, otherwise known as the Berkeley of the Midwest. This collection here probably means nothing to most people here, but this is a journal called Telos, T-E-L-O-S. I just returned actually from the first conference that the Telos organization, quite different from the original, and in fact, gave a presentation on the same topic as the previous course that I worked with Shrikant on. So for those who are interested, there is another 8-week course on 3 spheres: East, West, and digital. So I took the opportunity, as the conference was winding down today, to ask the question about the man who started the publication, Paul Piccone. And I asked whether or not he might have really been talking about subsidiarity. Lo and behold, he was. So little did I know that I was already plugging into the topic 50 plus years ago. Crazy how that works. Let's get right into the substance here. Next slide, please. Okay, as you recall, we have structured these sessions in terms of questions. And last week, we talked about subsidiarity in its origins and how this actually operates. Let me jump into a related topic that is extremely important for understanding what we're talking about here. What are the inner senses? So those of you who may have studied modern psychology may have noticed that cognitive psychology, as the successor to behaviorism, was up against Freud, Jung, and others, who we'll be talking about a bit today. And in the process, they collapsed the gap between the mind and the senses. That's a very serious mistake. And in fact, if we are going to solve the broader social problems that we're now dealing with, we will have to pack that gap up with something that you might think of in terms of the unconscious. We prefer the term subconscious, but all this chasing around about consciousness is akin to the famous cartoon where the drunkard is hanging onto the lamppost and the policeman says, "Sir, what are you doing?" And he says, "I'm looking for my keys." And of course, the policeman says, but you know your keys aren't there. And the answer that comes back, of course, is, yeah, I know my keys aren't there, but that's where the light is. So under the conditions of not being willing to look in dark places, we have seriously misled ourselves. The action is in the gap. And as a result of all of this, modern psychology will need to be replaced. We're going to replace it with a deeper understanding of what is in between the external senses and the intellect. There are a number of different accounts, but they all more or less agree that there are multiple faculties of the human soul. The human soul, as you will recall, was a big part of our previous discussions in the earlier sessions. I won't go into great detail for this, but as Shrikant has reminded me, I'm a bit behind in my bibliographies. So one of the things you'll see in the bibliography for today's session is a 5-year-long research effort. It's the most intense effort that the center has done on the topic of the inner senses. And so if you were to go to digitallife.center, which is the website for CSDL, you'll see a journal tab, and pull down that journal tab and you'll have 218 plus pages, annotated bibliography, all kinds of amazing material on just this subject: 4 powers or faculties: sensus communis, imagination, memory, and the cogitative power. This is human psychology as it was understood from Aristotle, roughly 4th century BC, all the way through until the 19th century, when experimental psychology turned us all into lab rats. We're not lab rats, and we're going to have to remember that. And the gap that we're talking about here, which can be described in sensory and intelligence terms. Obviously, intelligence is enormously important if we're trying to create artificial intelligence, which we'll discuss a bit later here. This is actually the gap between the material and the immaterial. So those of you who have been following neuroscience may have noticed that they are unable to locate a thought. They're even unable to locate a memory. They're unable to locate any of the higher functions because, in a certain sense, they are not there. They are immaterial in relationship to the sort of hunt that's underway to understand neurons. So what we're dealing with here is that in between, the meat in the sandwich, so to speak. The language that is often used for those who are dealing with this issue is conversion to the phantasm. I understand that's language which you're not familiar with, and that's fine. I'm just using the phrase here to help you understand there's a whole nother psychology that has largely been forgotten and now will need to be remembered if we are to remember what it means to be human. And so here, I'm obviously deliberately restating what many of you learned probably in Philosophy 101. Descartes' statement, "I think, therefore I am," is wrong. Human existence does not depend upon thinking. It depends upon sensing, and in particular, sensing in between the material and immaterial. That is the raw material, if you will, of human life. Next slide, please. So now let me relate this to why there is a D in front of Catholic social teaching for this entire course. Why does digital, and by the way, capitalizing in the way that I do this began when I was discussing these things on Facebook, and Facebook at that point, maybe still today, doesn't allow underlining, bold, and so forth. And so I decided all caps was a way to set it apart. But by that, I mean something much more than the technology. Digital is an environment. It is what we are now living in as an environment. This is what Marshall McLuhan initially called a medium, and then later inserted the environmental terminology to this. We call it a psycho-technological environment. So that environment, following McLuhan's instructions, that all of our inventions extend something about the human being. They are, as the footnote to the 1964 Understanding Media, the extensions of man. The question should be, well, what does digital technology extend? And the answer to that question is our memories. So from the previous slide, you will recall, memory was understood to be, for nearly 2 millennia, as a critical component of the human psyche. Psyche, of course, is the origin of psychology, study of the psyche. Psyche in Latin becomes anima, and ultimately in English it becomes soul. So this is a critical component of not just the human, as a matter of fact, because every living thing has a soul, but the human memory is being extended by digital. This is a contribution to the larger study of Marshall McLuhan that I guess we need to take some credit for. Marshall McLuhan, who died 1980, New Year's Day, actually, 1980, born in 1911, so he was 69 years old. It turns out that the McLuhan world has not really fully tried to grasp digital, and falsely suspects that this digital environment is just another version of the previous electric environment. It is not. It is fundamentally different. In fact, by extending memory and not imagination, another one of those faculties, we're getting into some really interesting territory here. So I'll briefly note here for you that in addition to many unusual things, perhaps, that I've done throughout my life, and no, I was not a longshoreman, and I never worked in a cannery, but I did actually architect computers professionally for many years. And what I discovered in that process may not be so obvious. So if you were to somehow crawl inside any digital system, the computer in front of you, the phone in your pocket, your doorbell, your television set, and you could somehow watch what the digital circuitry was actually doing, what is happening millisecond by millisecond, nanosecond by nanosecond, you would discover something fascinating. Very little time is spent computing. If by computing you mean adding numbers together, comparing numbers with each other, that is not what computers are actually doing most of the time. Instead, what they are doing is managing memory. So it is the management of memory that we will wind up, and have been, in fact, doing this now for a few decades, but we'll be doing it more and more intensely as we become self-aware of our mimicry of computer activities. Do androids dream of electric sheep? That, of course, is the title of a famous novel from Philip K. Dick, which was then turned into, with some very significant reductions. There's enormously important parts of the plot line of the novel that never made it into Blade Runner. So if you'd like to check that out, you'll find that in the bibliography when I finally get it done for this session. That may also be a topic of some interest. I am about to head off to a group that is examining this question in Warsaw, and in particular, working with the Hong Kong-based Hanson Robotics as they try to wrestle with the question that Hanson is the origin of something you may have seen, a robot that has been named Sophia, I believe made a citizen in Saudi Arabia, and perhaps some other places. They're trying to figure out how to build compassionate robots. Only group I've ever heard of doing this. I'm glad to be a part of it. It turns out that artificial intelligence, as the field is called, you can probably anticipate this, is not really what we're building. If in fact there is a sandwich, the input is the external senses. The output you could imagine to be the computational result. That schema simply does not describe humans. And so artificial intelligence is inherently a misnomer. It is not intelligence that we're operating on, but rather trying somehow to build a version of that in between. And the failure of artificial intelligence to grasp this is reflected in their failure to build anything that could possibly resemble a human. They will not be able to accomplish the goals they have set without paying attention to what we're talking about today. As it turns out, rationality is not possible without this in between. So you can picture an Oreo cookie. You can remove the filling. You can scrape out everything in the middle. It's no longer the same cookie. Without the subconscious, it is quite impossible to be rational as a human. The result of this is the failure of modern psychology. I don't want to belabor this. We've talked about it before, but it is extremely important to recognize that since we are now in a new paradigm, new paradigms mean new sciences. And modern psychology, I suspect, is in their own account, from what I know, having talked to many of them, it's already on the chopping block. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a topic I suppose there's a lot of people here on the call and who'll be listening to this, who'll be very interested in. Memory, as I've described it as a faculty of the human soul, is it possible to think of that as being somehow collective? Not individual, but collective. At this conference that I've just mentioned, the Telos conference I've come back from, discussing subsidiarity, so it's very much on my mind. The question of human rights came up in emphatic fashion. Is human rights a collective or an individual phenomenon? And the answer to that, of course, is in some sense both. But without the individual dimension to this, it truly makes no sense. The split between Freud and Jung, arguably, was on exactly this theme. Freud was focused on the individual. Jung, instead, suggested there is something collective about our memory, the so-called archetypes. Now, here I'm going to draw a critical distinction between the environment in which we have all been born and raised, the electric environment, and the digital environment which we have more recently been tossed into. We have been pushed off a cliff here, and that pushing off of a cliff and the sense of disorientation associated with that I believe, is the root cause of so much of our anxieties and the chaos we appear to be living in. The previous electric environment had the character of lumping everything all together. So the notion that there should be one world government is being caused by exactly the same environmental factors, often invisible, as caused Jung to lump everything together into this, everybody has the same set of archetypes. I'm not going to argue against that point of view. What I'm telling you is that that point of view could well be thought as being appropriate for the electric environment. It is, however, completely inappropriate for the digital environment, because the digital environment discriminates. It pulls things apart. It doesn't lump things together anymore. The term digital, of course, refers to our digits. The reason why I've tucked my thumb in is because the thumb is not considered by anatomists to be a digit. The big toe is. So that means that every human being has 18 digits. They are discrete. They're different from each other. We can wiggle one, we can wiggle another. That's what digital is about, is in fact pulling things apart, distinguishing, and in some ways, importantly, discriminating. The oceanic feeling, I just lost the slide on my screen, Shrikant, I don't know. I'll continue as Shrikant works on this. The oceanic feeling, which of course Freud made a big deal about, is electric. We do not have the same feelings when the environment changes and the balance of our inner senses change. And in fact, much of Freud is a deliberate electric attempt to counter what he had learned earlier in life. Freud's a very important character in at least my chronology here, because Sigmund Freud, a Jewish intellectual, grew up in Vienna, Austria. Those of you who are aware of Austrian history, you might very well recognize, as in fact is quite clear if you walk around the city of Vienna now. Vienna is not a Jewish town. It's a Catholic town. And in fact, Sigmund Freud's first teacher of psychology, the study of the psyche, was a Dominican priest by the name of Franz Brentano. So what we wind up with in Freud is different from what we wind up with in Jung. So they had to separate. Freud was trained in a previous orientation, that there was something inside of us that had structure. Jung, on the other hand, who was raised Lutheran in Switzerland, he had a very different view. Lutheran would be the book-based, print-based world, but he had gone all in on electric, and that's what the archetypes are all about. This traces back to something very old in Western civilization, the distinction between Plato and Aristotle. So as you might know, and I'm sure that there are some here who know more than I do, so I apologize for summarizing things in such a quick fashion. But Plato believed that the soul was collective, and furthermore, he believed, or at least expressed it, that we were all born with something like the archetypes. We were born with inherent knowledge of the ideals or the forms. And that really describes the most significant distinction between teacher Plato and his student Aristotle. Aristotle, correctly, I believe, instead insisted that we are not born with an innate sense of all these ideals, but rather have to discover them. We have to discover with our senses first. All knowledge is in the senses, Aristotle would have told us, not something inherent that we're born with. And I believe that is the direction in which we are now heading. Next slide, please. Okay, I apologize for the different font sizes and so forth. These slides are not entirely coherent in that sense, but you might ask us what happens. Okay, so if electric is collective and digital is discrete, when we go from lumps to distinctions under digital conditions, what happens? What happens to that collectivity? What happens to the universality? The very final panel in this Telos conference was trying to wrestle with the question of particularity and universality, or as it is sometimes put in philosophical terms, the one and the many. Very old question, obviously. My answer to that question is that we are all becoming less and less collective, more and more autonomous. And this question of human autonomy, of course, is one that we deal with every day. Do we believe what we see on television, the quintessential electric media? My suggestion is that long before Donald Trump brought up this accusation of fake news, we had already subconsciously come to the recognition that news was no longer in any way attempting to present what was actually going on, but had become, in fact, a part of a, let's be generous, entertainment activity. Those of you who may have worked in the television business, those of you who know about the structure of the business, in fact, what has happened, and it's been underway now for quite a long time. In fact, I think it was probably the 90s when this was most aggressively taking place. News divisions were shut down and they were then folded in underneath the entertainment divisions of the networks. Totally appropriate. So if news is entertainment, and as we might suspect, I was joking with Shrikant before about this Will Smith situation. As it turns out, the producer at the Oscars initially thought that that was staged. In fact, whether it was staged in the precise sense that there was no contact, it was clearly staged. And what we're dealing with here is yet another attempt to attract attention by people who are professional fakers. So all of this Hollywood stuff is fake, as you might suspect. Equally well, virtual reality is, by the name virtual reality, you should get a clue, it's fake. It's not real. So as the world of media becomes more and more unreal, we have to look elsewhere. And we have, obviously, a cornucopia of opportunities here. The digital environment for the first time in human history. So just imagine yourself to be in Alexandria, Egypt, somehow trying to go to the library of Alexandria and check out a scroll. So just think for a moment how complicated a process that would have been. In fact, it didn't even work that way. By and large, the library was not something that people could go and look things up in. There was no indexing capability. There wasn't a human being who had the memory to tell you where these things were located. And so when that library burned down, it was in a very important sense, more of a warehouse than it was a library. We all carry the total knowledge of the human race, such as it has been preserved, in our pockets. It is, I have used to say we carry the Library of Alexandria in our pocket, but that of course is wrong. It's so much more than the Library of Alexandria. And so this is a unique feature of the digital environment that allows us to find and crucially to share knowledge, which is what we are now trying to do, all of us together. This is accompanied by it's not just the fact that the news is fake. Increasingly, we're coming to the conclusion that the institutions that we have trusted are fake. One of the leading PR firms, Stahlman, you may know of them, they publish periodically a trust index. It has been plummeting. The general population's trust of major institutions, political, economic, social, and entertainment and beyond, has been absolutely falling off a cliff. This is Thelma and Louise, right off a cliff with no skid marks. And the result of this is that we are increasingly in our own autonomy, forced to figure it out ourselves. And that figuring it out ourselves, the invention of the individual, occurred in the earlier scribal environment, which is what is now being retrieved by digital technology. Next slide, please. So, the fake, no longer trusted television news endlessly tells us that all that matters is democracy. You know that cannot possibly be true. It is impossible for that medium to say something at that fundamental level. And so, in fact, when you hear words like democracy, you hear words like autocracy, autocrats, and so forth, you really have to like scrunch your face up and go, huh? What are they talking about? Here I will draw your attention to a particular book, title of which is Democratic Surround. It will be in the bibliography, which Shrikant has gently reminded me I need to catch up on. It turns out that Democratic Surround, written by a fellow that I know, Fred Turner at Stanford, is a discussion of how in the Cold War, what we now think of as democracy was invented as a psychological warfare weapon against our opponent, the Soviet Union. So you will hear a repeat as if somehow the record is broken, as if it really has no choice but to loop back again. You will be caught up in psychological warfare if you listen seriously to this discussion of democracy and autocracy. That is not what is going on. Or, as we used to say, you can fool some of the people some of the time. This attempt to fool us, this attempt to use these basic notions to steer our behaviors cannot be sustained. And in this, what we're going to wind up doing, inevitably, is saying, well, wait a minute, did somebody else talk about these topics? What was democracy considered, for instance, for those who thought about this carefully, in Athens, Greece, ancient Athens? And here, the reference, so I'm supplying myself with some guideposts here for this annotated bibliography that I'll be producing, is Aristotle's Politics. So those of you who may have read that will remember that he described three different ways that politics can be organized, with each of those three efforts to organize, the polos, a Greek word, having a healthy and a degenerate expression. The three, of course, are monarchy, one-person rule, oligarchy, group of people rule, and a republic, obviously a topic of great importance to his teacher, Plato. The degenerate form of a monarchy is tyranny. The degenerate form of an oligarchy, oligarchy is the degenerate form. Aristocracy was the positive description of this. Oligarchy is the degenerate form of this. So when you hear the word oligarch being thrown around, for instance, in terms of Russia, that's where that comes from. What was the degenerate form of a republic? And that answer, of course, was democracy. So this notion that we're all going to vote on all of these topics, direct democracy, is a deeply electric theme. It will not play out, and it absolutely will not work in that fashion as we move towards subsidiarity. I described subsidiarity at the conference earlier today in a way that is not quite the way that Wikipedia describes it. This is not just bringing decisions to the lowest possible level. In other words, small is beautiful, as Schumacher described it. There's something much more important than that. It is bringing decisions to the level where responsibility can be taken. And this notion of responsibility and the power associated with it is critical to how subsidiarity operates. As it turns out, reversing these two terms, power and responsibility, the other order, is the name of a very important series of lectures given just after World War II by somebody that we have done a lot of research on. He is a Catholic theologian by the name of Romano Guardini. We're about to take on the road to Toronto and Rome over the next 2 months, a dialogue between Marshall McLuhan and Romano Guardini, in which this topic of responsibility and power will be emphatically explored. Next slide, please. My guess is those on this call who are not practicing Catholics will be unfamiliar with the term synodality. So I'm just suggesting to you that if you wish to engage in a modern exploration of the application of subsidiarity, the efforts on the part of Pope Francis to encourage synodality throughout the church, and by the way, this reaches all the way down to the individual parish level. It's happening in Jersey City, where I live. It's happening all over the world. I would describe synodality as a specific effort to undermine, deliberately, organizationally undermine, the top-down organization that a shrinking and increasingly circle the wagons Catholic Church has found itself under electric conditions, replacing it with not top-down, not bottom-up, not strictly hierarchical, not flattening the entire hierarchy, but rather from the middle out, where the most important middle here is the family. So from the standpoint of human society, the most important institution is not the individual in their separate life. It is not the state. It is not the church. It is, in fact, the family. And from the family as an intermediate institution, we then wind up engaging in a variety of intermediate institutions. It's not the market. It's not the state. That sort of a contrast is really filled with poverty and quite misleading. Synodality is the process of listening in both directions, both up and down, and trying to take into account totality in order that responsibilities can match up with decision-making powers. This has a massive impact on such topics as experts and bureaucracies. Those of you who have studied political science, those of you who have been interested perhaps in your own life, in the role that you might play. Are you going to wind up getting a PhD? Are you wind up being recognized as an expert? Are you going to wind up joining committees? Are you going to wind up being part of some permanent unelected bureaucracy? All of that has been tossed up in the air. And indeed, probably not surprisingly, given my description of Aristotle's political categories, the notion of monarchy is back on the table. Not just back on the table in a sense of maybe we should go back to kings and queens, where here we're about to go through a transition in the UK as we lose Elizabeth and get Charles. But rather, around the world, as it turns out, there are some very important monarchs. The first of those, of course, is the Pope. And we're going to hear next week from Victor Guyton, author of the book God's Diplomats, about the role that that monarchy plays and how it operates. But I'll just note for you that Japan is a monarchy. You might think that the Queen of England really doesn't matter. Not true. You might think that the Emperor of Japan doesn't matter. Not true. The future of Japan is intimately bound up, in fact, with the emperor and its relationship to the structure of Japanese society, and not just Japanese society. Since the installation of the emperor is a Taoist ceremony, it has enormous resonance in China. So is Xi Jinping president of China, or is he the monarch? And how does this relate to the whole question of autocracy, which is a term that truly does not describe China or, I suspect, Russia either? Let me finish on this very quick summary here by drawing a distinction between what you might imagine happens when dogma is established and your suspicion that that means no discussion. Not true. Everybody has to believe in some rigid sense and publicly express exactly the same thing. Not true. In fact, the process that the church goes through, called catechesis, if it is reduced to simply memorizing and repeating dogma, is clearly something a robot could do. If dogma had that sort of character, then we would be fleshbots. That is not the way this works. Catechesis requires that the inner senses, the beginning of today's presentation, be deeply engaged with these topics. We'll return to these subjects more, I hope, in Q&A. Next slide, please. Okay, last of the slides. Here we are, roughly 45 minutes in, so I seem to be doing okay on time. Let me just lightly touch upon these topics under the heading, can our current philosophy and science handle what we're now going through? The answer to that is simply no. There is very little reason for us to argue with Kant anymore. Very little reason for us to study and be very concerned about what Hegel had to say anymore. The list goes on. It's interesting, certainly, and probably important for fleshing out what the electric environment did. But Nietzsche and Heidegger, who've attracted so much attention and continued to come up probably far more commonly than they should have in this conference I was just at, they are quite obsolete. And in this, I'm not trying to express a disagreement with them. I'm not saying I have better ideas than Kant, Hegel, on and on. I'm simply saying they were appropriate to the environment in which they arose. The debates that occurred in that environment, in many cases, were quite vital and important, but we're not doing that anymore. We're in a new paradigm. And so, as Thomas Kuhn informed us in his 1962 Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which I'm not endorsing in complete ways. In fact, my father was a historian of ancient mathematics, and the historians of science thought he'd gotten everything quite wrong, thought that he had really destroyed the field. I think that may still be a common feeling, but we're in a new paradigm. We need new sciences. And in fact, they have already begun to be developed. Furthermore, human free will, which has been discarded largely by both philosophy and science at the current times, and has been countered, that whole process of eliminating free will under electric conditions was obviously countered by a major emphasis on the topic of liberty. So I hope Bill is with us, and we will find out how he's feeling about these topics now. Libertarianism and anarchy and so forth are electric phenomena. These are not scribal, these are not print phenomena, these are electric phenomena. And they are, if you will, the other side of the coin from the collectivity. We're not doing that anymore either. Instead, what we're doing is we are recovering notions of natural law, as must happen for us to form new sciences. We are aggressively recognizing that the Enlightenment, however interesting, however convoluted, however impactful it was in its day, simply no longer applies. It's obsolete. And so I'll just finish with this motto, which will likely provoke some more questions. Digital, the psychotechnological environment that we now live in, retrieves the sensibility and many of the structures and forms of the medieval ages, particularly the medieval ages after the shift from writing on plants to writing on animals. The shift from papyrus to vellum, of course, is a critical technological shift that occurred in the midst of the scribal age. So we are retrieving, most importantly, what we now have. By the way, the Library of Alexandria, if it had not burned down, it would have fallen apart anyway. That material did not have longevity. So our retrieval of the medieval will wind up being a very important topic in our next two sessions, as Victor, in particular, comes as a guest lecturer next week on the first of two sessions on solidarity. And then it will become also quite important in the final session 2 weeks from today. Thank you all very much for participating. I hand it back to Srikant.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Folks, it's time for questions. I myself have lots and lots of questions, but your questions take priority. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you would like to ask questions. Try to keep your questions concise so we can get to as many questions and as many answers as we possibly can. We will start with, give me just a second here. I'm going to unmute everybody. Okay. Folks, try to keep the questions on the topic of the presentation. We're going to start with Mr. Maxwell House. Mr. Maxwell House, go ahead.
I guess I wasn't prepared to be first, but I guess one main question that I really had, and this was something that I thought about before your presentation and been thinking about your presentation all week, was what's the relationship between modern corporations and what you are phrasing as the retrieval of medieval synodality? Are corporations an electric manifestation? Second question, how does the new scribal age manifest itself? Like, what's an example of something that we have now which is explicitly scribal, because YouTube and social media are carryovers from the electric age? Last question is more of a dispute, because you said something about virtual reality, but the root for virtual is, of course, in virtue, which it was kind of twisted, according to my brief search, to in the 1500s, which of course was the Enlightenment. But that's all.
Wonderful. Excellent questions. Thank you. Thank you, Max. Bruce, go ahead, and it's your turn. Go ahead and ask 1 or 2 questions that pertain to anything that is presented. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious why, or if Mark has encountered neurolinguistic programming and how it incorporates the senses way differently from behaviorism or cognitive stuff.
Wonderful.
Does he see that as a part of the solution for the new psychology?
Wonderful. Excellent. Folks, go ahead and type an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom if you have more questions. Give me just a second here. I'm going to give a couple of seconds for people to go ahead. Give about 10-15 seconds to go ahead and ask if you have any questions at this point. You can keep adding questions as we go on. So let's start with Max's question of what is explicitly scribal today? Can you point to how the scribal will manifest itself in the digital, and what would it look like?
So Maxwell House is unlikely to be your real name, which is fine. Do you remember the jingle associated with Maxwell House coffee? I think it went something like this. But there's more that I could say on that subject. My guess is that everybody here has recognized that there are differences in our own memory, whether we write it down or type it out or try to memorize something. And so I think probably the best answer for you is that using our hands has shifted into something a bit more mechanical, so that critique is fair, but the retrieval of calligraphy is clearly one aspect of what's going on here. And I will note here in particular, the importance of calligraphy in Chinese society is radically different than it is in the West. So I will just simply note that when I first engaged with China, it was one of the 10 or so families that then ran China. That is no longer the case. But what tended to happen when senior officials and others got to an age where they were able to step away from daily duties, very often they would wind up becoming painters of Chinese characters. So the scribal nature of Chinese society, I would suggest, is something you need to deeply take into account for the West to be able to build the kind of authority in global affairs. It will have to begin to understand this better. It will have to move beyond simply being digital and typing, but then, in fact, probably returning to handwriting. So I will make an anticipation, not a prediction here, that there will be a increasing movement amongst many of us and perhaps our children back towards cursive writing as one of the expressions of this. Now, scribble does not necessarily mean pen on paper. What scribble means in our use of the term here, of course, is that it has been written in some way or another, and then, in fact, is remembered as a result of that. As we go back, of course, to the Phaedrus and the famous Plato's famous juxtaposition, not using Socrates is quoting here Thoth and the Pharaoh, where Thoth, the inventor of writing, goes to Pharaoh and says, "No, wait a minute. This is not like you described it at all. This is terrible. We will forget everything." So scribal here describes the age of literacy beginning in the axial age, roughly 500 BC, up through the, not the invention, but the social adoption of the printing press. So if it's human beings who are writing things, whatever technology they might use, blogging is a scribal activity with all of the rest associated with it. And so probably the best answer, Maxwell, is that everybody has now become a literateur. And the shift towards everybody now becoming an author is a very deeply scribal and radically different from the conditions of the printing press that required that there be a market to sell that material. We now live in a world in which people are writing without any concern for the marketability of what they are writing. That's very scribal.
Wonderful. So I'm going to put some more questions on the table. I'll put one of mine and then I'll have Joe put one. You talked about managing memory as being the hallmark of the digital age. You also talked about subsidiarity in the social organization as the hallmark. What is the connection between managing of memory on one hand and subsidiarity? How are those two connected? So that's my question, but let's take Joe's question as well. Joe, go ahead.
So I'm interested, thank you again for joining us today. I'm a little bit interested in this middling out strategy that the church will be using going forward. I mean, the idea that their family is going to be the center of this. and things like marriage are being redefined, and you're starting to see these like this, what a family means to be kind of redefined. How is this going to be like a sustainable strategy when the Catholic Church has a very kind of ancient view of what it means to be a family?
Oh,
Well,
very good. So go ahead, Mark. We can start with this question. You can, use it to talk about subsidiarity in general and address this question.
Well, needless to say, you don't need to be Catholic to recognize that the core structure that is appealed to by the Catholic Church is the Holy Family. Mary, Jesus, Joseph as an example, but also the father and son relationship and beyond. And so baked in at the lowest possible level, the most fundamental level in the, not just Catholic Church, but the Christian approach is a notion of the family. Now, if you mean an ancient notion of the family, clearly those who do not produce children makes it extremely difficult, as many in the gay community would agree. And so therefore we have figured out substitutes for that. And so the shift towards other forms of reproduction, particularly for those who can't conceive for one reason or another, is picking up, I think, a great deal of steam. And so the topics of abortion, the topics of adoption, these are likely to become, again, far more important topics of discussion as we go forward. And the meaning of the family, not just the sacred Holy Family, but all human families. We've gone from a situation where Mao Zedong's one-child policy has been removed. Needless to say, a population of only children really messes up your head. And so getting not necessarily back to 6, 8, 10 children, but larger families and extended families, obviously, relationship with grandparents and so forth. This is an inevitable consequence of the digital environment. And you can point to all sorts of examples. Probably, since you raised the question, you would have more in mind than I would. But if you just start looking for it, it's all around.
Wonderful. Next, let's take my question. What is the relationship between managing memory and subsidiarity in social context?
It's easy, Shrikant. We do not have to remember everything. We only have to remember what we're responsible for. So somebody is going to have to run the army, not us. So we do not have to remember all the details that are required associated with the responsibility of being a general. We do not have to remember how to fabricate semiconductors. Even though that information is available to us, without the responsibility associated with it, if we do not attach through subsidiarity responsibility to a particular memory, then it becomes superfluous. So the structuring of memory, hierarchically and subject-wise, now becomes deeply associated with the responsibility that subsidiarity brings as we, in fact, restructure, reform social institutions.
Wonderful. Next question. What is the connection, similarities and differences between modern corporations and the concept of
Sure.
synodality?
Synodality. Well, clearly, if you're a serious corporation, you must be multinational. In addition to being multinational or globalist, I remember when I was on Wall Street. So those of you who have perhaps taken the detour into LinkedIn, which is where you'll find my biography online, you'll notice that I was a Wall Street analyst for many years, and the whole topic of scaling, the whole topic of endless growth, the whole topic of where's my next market going to come from, the whole topic of the way it was described often was ROW, rest of world. When are you going to finally get to rest of world? That impulse is the electric impulse for corporations. And so what happens, Maxwell's correct, of course, the corporation has a much longer history than electric. Arguably, what we would think of as a corporation probably has its origins most importantly in the print era. So we have East India Company, for instance, and the whole notion of stock-based corporations as a limitation on risk. This came in along with print. That kind of a corporation is quite different. IBM is not the East India Company. And so what has happened here is that the modern corporation has adopted many of the characteristics of electricity. I strongly suspect that what's going to happen here, and this is being widely evident among the circles that I gravitate towards, is that people are leaving large corporations. People are not just because they want to be entrepreneurs and get rich, which tends to be the one of the impulses, but I believe most studies of startup corporations have to do with the urges of the entrepreneur to tell people what to do. So that kind of hierarchical, I'm the boss and you work for me, even in a small corporation, winds up being another electric expression. So my best guess is that we're going to wind up with 10 times the number of corporations that we have. There'll be a great deal of experimentation in terms of how to best organize these corporations. The urge to continually scale, as driven by stock market and so forth, will diminish greatly. And so the age of the multinational corporation is over. And I think very few smart 20-somethings coming out of college find that attractive, at least fewer and fewer year by year.
Thank you. Next question is about NLP. Are you familiar with NLP? And if so, what do you think of it?
Sure. In modern times, Bruce, as you know, probably quite well, NLP, like most of these three-letter abbreviations, they wind up being repurposed. And so nowadays, NLP is natural language processing because it falls out of the whole AI world. But here's my direct thought about NLP. So those of you who are unfamiliar with NLP, it winds up being, among other things, a fairly sophisticated set of techniques about interactions between humans. And a lot of it has to do with facial expressions. So NLP, I think, was designed as another alternative to try to get at those inner senses without expressing the inner senses in the way I've described it, but nonetheless recognizing that there was something going on in the middle of the Oreo cookie. And asking people to sit down on a couch, Freudian couch or something else, was probably not the best way to get access to that, but rather it would be expressed day in and day out. I had a very interesting experience yesterday. One of the, and Debbie was there also, I don't know if you noticed this, Debbie, but one of the smarter people in the room at this conference is a student at Yale, and he's of Chinese descent. What I noticed was that he put his face mask on only when one particular speaker got up on the podium. So you're all familiar with the fact that people have figured out ways to try to defeat facial recognition. In a sense, NLP was an early version of facial recognition. And when Gordon Chang, who I suppose many of you know because he's all over the news, quite an interesting fellow, as it turns out. When Gordon Chang got up on the podium, he put his face mask on. I can only presume it wasn't because he thought Gordon Chang, who previously was sitting next to him, was somehow going to infect him 15 feet away. He did not want Gordon Chang to see what he did with his mouth, what he did with his facial expressions. And he was probably being very careful in terms of how he expressed it with his eyes. Now, I will finish this now somewhat lengthy response, and I look forward, because I know Bruce has a lot more questions, and we're going to take some of that offline, and I'm looking forward to that. But Bruce will know the role of a gentleman by the name of Gregory Bateson in the early days of NLP. Gregory Bateson turns out to be, for me, probably one of the more fascinating electric figures. I will just simply summarize this by saying that Gregory Bateson was a serious rival of my godfather, Norbert Wiener. In the preface to Norbert Wiener's 1948 book, Cybernetics, he explicitly says, Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, who were then married, want me to turn all of my attention to solving all the problems of society using cybernetics. I'm not going to do it, he said. And so Gregory Bateson grows out of a very interesting corner of the electric world, as NLP does. My suggestion to you, Bruce, it is time to replace NLP with a deeper understanding of the inner senses.
Wonderful. Next question is going to be from Mr. Maxwell House. Go ahead.
Just one question. So you mentioned that we're going to need a new psychology and new sciences, and you mentioned something earlier which made me think of a book, and it was called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And I read this book as I was getting interested in design and engineering, because that was something that I wanted to do for a while. Right. Do you think that the ideas that he expresses in that book, if you're familiar with it, are anything close to what we're approaching, or is it still stuck in the old paradigm?
I'm an old man. Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance came about a long time ago. Do you recall the year it was first published?
I had assumed it was published in the 60s or the 70s, but I don't know.
I think it probably was. And I was around in those days, and I read it when it was first published. Zen, that would be the appropriate time period, because that would be when the work of D.T. Suzuki and Alan Watts and so forth had brought the topic of Zen being a Japanese version of Chinese Chan Buddhism, had become a popular item. Obviously, the title of a book, the goal of which is to sell many copies, has to be popular. So Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance could only be published in a period in which the publisher decided everybody wants to know about Zen. So rather than talk about what was said in that book, which I suspect does not do a particularly good job of capturing the actual Zen, but rather a kind of a ersatz popular Zen. So let's just try to locate this somewhere in relationship to today's conversation. Zen in particular, having passed through the intestines of China and winding up on the plate in Japan, this is okay, all right. As it turns out that we have the opportunity now, because we can get on an airplane and we've got a visa and we can all go visit Japan. Used to be that we could all go visit China. Unfortunately, nobody's been able to do that for a while, but that'll come back one of these days. So we can actually go there and find out about these things ourselves. But in McLuhan's time, for instance, or let me take Ezra Pound's time as a mentor to him. There's an author by the name of Fenollosa, who became a member of a turn of the 20th century, very small group, probably could be called a Zen cult in Japan. That shrunken knowledge of all of this then propagated through a lot of other people as, well, this must be what Zen is all about. The net of this, you already know, Maxwell. These are various attempts to capture the subconscious. We can all do the following, in addition to my poor imitation of the Maxwell House coffee jingle. We can all hear the sound of one hand clapping, but that's not what it was actually meant. And in fact, I just got introduced in a serious way to something that I'm going to study, hopefully with the help of one of the people I met today. I wonder if anybody here is familiar with something called the Kyoto School of Japanese philosophy, which was quite important, particularly as it was building through the 20s and 30s, and then became more identified with that in the 40s, and then wound up being dismissed, obviously because of Imperial Japan, and is now coming back into great interest, I understand, within Japan. This is it's a political scientific expression of Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance in terms of grappling with the notion of nothing and nothingness. These are subconscious probes. This is the way other societies, and I'm actually now quite serious, because I did at one point in my career, actually as an undergraduate, I double majored in Mahayana Buddhist theology before heading to the University of Chicago to study the Old Testament. But the West has a very difficult time truly understanding these things. And in a society like Japan or China, which do not have a psychology, in many ways, Zen is the closest thing you will find to a subconscious psychology in a society that did not have the same alphabetic basis, didn't have Aristotle. And so I'm sorry for the roundabout answer here, but the impulse to try to understand the functioning of the subconscious mind and its relationship to human society and individual accomplishment, as expressed in Zen Buddhism in Japan and then later popularized. I think this is all part of the effort to retrieve a better understanding of the human psyche. And I'm not going to dismiss it. I want to include it in our increased and improved understanding.
Thank you. Next up is Mike. Mike, could you go ahead and ask a brief question?
A similar question to what I've asked before about the realist, the optimist, the pessimist, and the opportunist.
Right.
Where do you think we're standing in light of the two new sessions we've had, and whether we're headed toward collapse or a new renaissance? Thank you.
Excellent question, Mike. The answer is quite straightforward. We are well into a new renaissance. It will appear to be a collapse to many people because they have so tightly wed themselves to the past, what McLuhan called rearview mirror. So we're walking around in a world in which some people think it's a renaissance, some people think it's a collapse, and what I will add to those four cardinal points you just suggested as alternative attitudes towards this is the answer that Marshall McLuhan gave when asked, Marshall, I've got to know, are you an optimist or a pessimist? He said, that's easy. Neither. I am an apocalypsist. Now, those of you with a little bit of etymological origins of words, and Maxwell was asking about the origin of virtue earlier, so let me compliment, don't get a chance to get to that question. Those who go to etymological dictionaries and ask that question, where did that word come from? These people are going to do well. That is a grammarian's approach to these sort of topics. Apocalypse means revelation. It does not mean the end of the world. It has been conflated with the end of the world, and you will see endlessly from the title of the movie Apocalypse Now, on and on and on. These are inappropriate uses of the term. In fact, the end of the world is the eschaton, which is really quite different from an apocalypse. And so Marshall McLuhan was an apocalypsist because he was not interested in either being optimistic or pessimistic or realistic even. He was interested in helping to reveal. So I think what's going to happen here, Mike, is that those who adopt an attitude, as Maxwell has, of being a grammarian, where the origins of words matter, and the grammar, structure of language matters, are likely to become apocalypses. We will be surrounded by people who, instead of trying to be the smartest kid in the class, instead of trying to be recruited by Goldman Sachs, are far more likely to want to grapple with the revelations that are occurring all around us. So I'm suggesting you might add revealer to that list that you gave in the question.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. Mark, could you give us a preview of the next two sessions coming up?
Yes. So the structure of this, the grammar of this 8-week course was 2 + 2 + 2 + 2 = 8. That's a far more interesting equation than 2 + 2 = 4, because now we're onto something beyond that. The grammar of the those 4 collectants. The first 2, of course, were on some background and some history and how we got into the situation and a little bit about what digital means. Then we did 2 on the topic of the pillar of digital of Catholic social teaching, which we're now describing as digital Catholic social teaching, of human dignity. So this was the topic of the human soul. We are now completed the second of those 2 pillars, subsidiarity, and so therefore the last 2 sessions will be on the 3rd pillar of Catholic social teaching, solidarity. Next week we will have a guest speaker. He will talk for probably about half an hour or so. We will combine that with 15 minutes worth of introduction and discussion between myself and him. I will point you all to Victor Gaitan's book, God's Diplomat. And so what you're going to hear next week is, among other things, the critical role that the Pope has played in the Ukraine crisis. So you might wonder if I should pay attention to what CNN tells me. Now, if you watch CNN, and I do actually watch it from time to time, they have been paralyzed at what they don't know what to describe of what Russia's doing here. What's going on with these negotiations? What's going on with the repositioning of the troops? The answer is the Pope has intervened in this conflict to bring it to an end. I think that's the answer we're going to get from Victor. So we're going to have a very immediate, what is happening right now today, what's got everybody very concerned, discussion by one of the very few experts of this topic outside of diplomacy, of course, has to happen in secrecy. So outside of the Secretary of State of the Vatican, Victor has got to be the best person to describe this. So we're going to get some real up-to-date understanding of how solidarity works. The last session, 2 weeks from today, will be me trying to wrap all of this up, bring all these pieces together, and then we'll have a party. Thank
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you very much, everybody. Great questions. Please go to the Hyperbook. I've just put it in the chat. You can go to the Hyperbook. You can watch the videos of the past sessions. They are all indexed by questions asked. You're able to comment there. We will have all kinds of other material there. So it's all there. Go ahead and participate by clicking on the Hyperbook now. And we will see you next time. We have 2 more sessions left. See you next time. Bye, everybody. Bye, Mark.